along with others who experienced historic forced adoption. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, given events surrounding the Hillsborough disaster, I have some understanding of historic injustices and how they burn. So when some time ago Anne told me her story, I became very interested in how the historic practice of forced adoptions could be brought to light, and what's more, how this came to happen at all. And since that time, my constituent, who's an adult whose mum was also treated in this way, has been in touch with me. Sarah, my constituent, now runs a small charity that helps people to trace family members. She's explained to me how long-standing distress caused by the practices we will discuss today can cloud a whole person's life. Sarah suggested to me that the government might in fact want to look at a small specialised service dedicated to the group affected, an idea I'll say more about later, but one which I think has merit. But first, let me say something about the story. Now, it's estimated that about 500,000 British women were treated in this fashion, all of whom have families who were affected, and all of whom must have been profoundly changed by the experience. So I want to talk about Anne, whose story I have come to see is typical of many. Anne's dad was a steel worker at Shotton, which is quite near my constituency, and their family weren't at all wealthy. Anne became unexpectedly pregnant in 1966 when an older man who she worked with forced himself upon her. Her family were horrified, and decisions were taken that she would move away, where she would meet with a local moral welfare worker, and that's what social workers used to be called. And it was just assumed that the baby would be adopted. And this moral welfare worker told Anne that the baby would cause her family hardship. She was told if she loved the baby, she would give it away. She was told it was for the best. And Anne ended up in what we think was a home run by Swansea and Brecon Moral Welfare Association, which was absolutely draconian and forced women to clean and undertake menial tasks. And from speaking to lots of others who've gone through this, I understand that that was very common. For the many stories of women who were treated just like Anne, there is one consistent impression. It seems obvious that those in positions of power who the women came into contact with felt that they ought to be punished. It's almost like there was some unwritten policy that women ought to be treated badly. And I think we owe it to that generation of women to ask ourselves, who decided that they should be treated in this way? Why were the homes run like that? Whose policy was it? And then there's a further crucial fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, in that most of the people that I've spoken to who experienced this gave birth in the NHS. The National Health Service, which we rightly venerate, was part of this story. The midwives seemed to give the impression to the mums that they knew that their babies were for adoption. And the women I have spoken to have a consistent history of their treatment during labour, in that pain relief was withheld. If stitches were required after the birth, as they often are, Madam Deputy Speaker, then this was done in the most uncomfortable way possible. And Anne, who, as I said, later herself became a nurse, told me that in hospital she realised she was absolutely powerless. After the birth, mothers were often told, your baby's going to be adopted, don't get too attached. Contact with the baby was controlled and restricted in many cases I have read about. And even by the standards of the time, they were treated very differently to other women giving birth. And these women were made to feel ashamed of their bodies, of their pregnancies. And it's that culture of shame that was perpetrated by officialdom in one guise or another. Now, it's a complex history, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I, for one, would like to know how it happened. Babies were then adopted, and from accounts I have read and listened to, it's very hard to see that any meaningful consent was given, and many of the adopted parents, who were dedicated and wonderful people, did give them loving homes. And mums were constantly told that this was simply just for the best. But even where children were in loving homes, how could it be for the best if it wasn't really your decision, Madam Deputy Speaker? I don't think that that can be right. I think that these women seem to be denied their most basic right, the right to hold your own opinion. So this is my question for the Minister. Has anybody checked historical records to discover what we know about how women were treated and why? Has anyone in government ever looked back over the records that are held about the NHS to find out what the process was for assisting young mums from Moral Welfare Association homes? What's more, who paid for these homes and why? Much may not have been written down, but I find it very hard to believe that nothing was and that there are no records. What's more, from their accounts, it appears that many of these women were unable to make an informed decision about their pregnancy and adoption because they were told that their family would not get any state support for their child. Yet Beveridge's welfare state existed from 1948 onwards. By the 1960s, though it was imperfect, it was well developed. And I've asked the House of Commons Library, Madam Deputy Speaker, what the rules were for supporting children from 1948 onwards, and I'm told that there were family benefits available, especially after the creation of child benefit in 1975. But even before that, family allowance, which was worth about £800 a year in today's money in the late 1960s, and this information seems to have been hidden from these young mums. Why was that? Who decided that that would be? So, Madam Deputy Speaker, we can never re-legislate the past. We can't. But we must try and understand it. And these policies were designed to make a so-called problem go away. Society had decided that something that is entirely natural was shameful. Women and children were hidden away to protect the fragile sensibilities of others, and it was a great injustice. And then that culture of terror and shame has made them keep quiet, and for far too long, we've been told about this generation of mums that she gave the baby up, a phrase that undoubtedly implies consent, when actually that was never true. It's been quite a hurtful lie, Madam Deputy Speaker. Women were told that it would be for the best, and then the world was told that that was what they wanted. Clearly, there's been a huge impact on the generation of children that were adopted too. Many of the adopted families, as I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, would have been loving and brilliant homes, but the cultural story that these children were given up for adoption may well have meant that those adult children still live with the idea that they weren't wanted by their birth parents, which in many cases was just not true at all. And the long shadow of this has huge implications for the mental health of mothers and their children and the families that these policies affected. For some, it's been utterly devastating and has had the most significant consequences on their lives. The government today could assist in setting the story straight and helping people to understand what happened to them. Which brings me to my final point, an apology. As I have said several times, it's not for this House to legislate over the past, nor is it for us to decide that there ought to be one blanket approach for every family. Many will wish to just turn the page in their history and move on. But for those living with desperate grief or furious anger, there is a course which I believe would help. And in addition to looking for all government sources of information in this process and publishing them in an appropriate manner, the Prime Minister, I think, on behalf of our nation, should apologise. Julia Gillard, the Prime Minister of Australia, did so on behalf of her country in 2013, and Leo Varadkar did so on behalf of Ireland this year. There is no reason not to do it, and every reason to do it. As a woman who's experienced that culture of shame that stops women feeling proud and confident in their own skin, I would like to understand this history a little better. Women collectively live in the shadow of these events and learn from their teenage years that their body is something to be embarrassed about. Undoing that cultural attitude requires for all of us an acknowledgement of how wrong this course of action was. So here is my request to the Minister. Let's collectively tell the truth. Acknowledge that the history of women in this country is not just the heroism of the suffrage movement and then the presence of a female Prime Minister with zero struggles in between. Show that the origin of the shame that stops women standing up for themselves now, today, is these dark roots that we talk about this afternoon. Bring those roots out into the open, say it was wrong. In summary, the government could do three things. Check all official records and documentation for evidence that related to this practice and publish it. Second, work with organisations who support people who experience the consequences of historic forced adoption, and do something to help with tracing and counselling and emotional support. Because this is a relatively discrete group of people, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it would not be an investment from government that was needed forever, though it's very much needed now. And lastly, and most crucially, say sorry, apologise on behalf of the nation. Simply by doing so, the Prime Minister would make a great difference to all those who were told that the natural function of their body was a shameful thing. Simply by apologising, the Prime Minister would send a message to anyone unexpectedly pregnant today that they ought to expect help and support and never approbation. And most of all, she would send a message to every woman in this country that our past, where women were blamed and robbed of their power, is finally the past.
The question is, as on the order paper, Stephen Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And first of all, can I thank and pay tribute to my friend, the member for Wirral South, who I think has set out the case for this motion incredibly powerfully. And it'll be a very tough speech for me to follow in the debate here this afternoon. Can I start, Madam Deputy Speaker, by thanking the ongoing efforts of campaigners from the Movement for an Adoption Apology, known colloquially as MAR, and others who have been pushing the government, this government and previous governments, for many, many years on this important demand for an apology. And in particular, can I thank my stepmum, Jean Robertson-Malloy, who is here with us today. Jean is one of the founding members of the MAR campaign. And can I join my honourable friend in thanking our good friend and former colleague Anne Keane, who is also here with us today. The MAR campaigners have experienced firsthand many of the issues which my honourable friend set out so powerfully in her opening speech, and they have provided testimony that reflects the pain and suffering that they have experienced. I'm also thinking today of the thousands of women and indeed their children who still today find this situation too painful to discuss openly. As my honourable friend has set out, all of them deserve an apology for the ordeal that they were put through. As has already been said, this is not just part of our hidden past as a country, it has been the hidden past of many other countries around the world. Many women who suffered in Australia or in Ireland have now had some form of inquiry or apology from their governments. And in New Zealand, the new Prime Minister, Jacinta Allen, is currently considering asking a New Zealand Select Committee to investigate how previous governments in that country handled the issue of forced adoption. Yet we still await any inquiry or apology here. We have an opportunity to learn from these other countries, these close allies of the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand and Ireland, and crucially to develop a process that learns from what happened in those three countries, that really engages with the voices and experiences of the women and children affected at the time. I think at the heart of this, it is a human rights issue. Article 8 of the Human Rights Act outlines the right to respect family and private life. Surely in this case of forced adoptions, it is absolutely clear that the parents and children have been denied this basic of human rights. And if the government accepts that that is the case, then surely we have a responsibility as a country, and they have a responsibility as a government, to address this urgently. As my honourable friend said, 5 years ago now, the then Prime Minister of Australia, Julia Gillard, apologised on behalf of the Australian government to people who had been affected by forced adoption or removal policies. And a Senate inquiry, which had been the impetus for Julia Gillard's apology, had found that babies were taken illegally by doctors, nurses, social workers and religious figures, and adopted by married couples. The mothers were often coerced, sometimes even drugged, and had their children taken away from them without their consent. Original birth certificates were then sealed away, a new one was issued which left no mention of the birth parents. This story, Madam Deputy Speaker, is all too familiar to the women and girls in this country who were caught in similar circumstances from the 1950s onwards. And as my honourable friend said, only last month, the Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland, Leo Varadkar, recognised the issues surrounding forced adoption of children in Ireland, and he apologised to 126 people who had been adopted illegally between 1946 and 1969, saying the apology was, and I quote, part of another chapter from the very dark history of our country. His government committed to an independent investigation to review the records of adoption services, which will almost certainly lead to the discovery that more births were illegally registered in Ireland. Now, of course, apologising for the actions of past governments is not straightforward. But I would say to the Minister that the fact now that both Ireland and Australia have been able to do so and haven't simply apologised, they've held thorough and in-depth investigations as well. These two factors show that it is possible to achieve some justice, delayed justice at that, for people who've been caught up in this scandal. And I urge him and urge the Prime Minister to follow the example of these close allies and devise a way to apologise. But of course, an apology is one aspect of justice. Speaking earlier to the campaigners, they made very clear to me that they do want an apology, but they actually want a process in which their voices are heard, their experiences are taken into full account. Their voices are, of course, those that we need to listen to. And I want to spend a moment or two now recalling the testimony of some of them. Helen Jeffries gave birth to a son in Leeds in 1965. When her son was 2 months old, her social worker refused them any more help, said they had to leave the mother and baby home they were staying in. Helen eventually had to give up her son for adoption. At the time, this meant that she would never get to see her son again, as the legislation that is now in place to request a birth certificate at an 18th birthday didn't exist at that time. Helen said, "I was 18 and a perfectly competent mother. I wanted to keep him. Sadly, as we've already heard from my honourable friend, and I'm sure we'll hear other accounts during the debate this afternoon, Helen was coerced into giving her son up for adoption." Of course, a lot of the testimony that I've read and that I've heard about first hand does involve children being forcibly removed from their parents. This scandal forces us, though, to engage with some of the wider social attitudes that prevailed at the time in the 1950s and the 1960s. Often young, single mothers were ostracised from their communities and from their families simply because they were pregnant. They might be referred to as troublemakers or deviants or in some way morally or mentally at fault. In a society where that narrative is widely shared in families, in communities, by the churches, and indeed by government and parliament even at the time, it was no wonder that many women felt pressured and felt that they had no other choice but to give up their children. Lorna gave birth to a girl in 1969. Her boyfriend had thrown her out of the house while she was pregnant, and she ended up squatting in London. As with many women at the time, her family was strict, so she didn't feel she had the option to go back to the family home, and she was placed in the care of a religious social worker who forced her to read the Bible regularly, simply to account for the dreadful sin of being a single mother-to-be. She was told by the church that she had no choice but to give her daughter up for adoption, with no empathy, no compassion. And a few months after she was born, Lorna's child was adopted, and they didn't see each other for another 36 years. These are just two examples, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are hundreds of Helens and Lornas who have been caught up in this national scandal, and they've been waiting patiently for years, in fact for decades, for some kind of explanation, for some kind of justice as to why they were forced to give up their children. Lorna says, and I quote, "Although an apology cannot heal the pain of separation that thousands of women like myself have had to deal with, I would like to hear someone in authority say that simple word, sorry. We have a right to it." I believe that these women, these mothers, absolutely have the right to an apology. And I'm glad, and I thank the Backbench Business Committee, that we have this opportunity today to amplify support in this chamber for that call. In her 2013 apology, Julia Gillard said, "As a nation, we've got to be prepared to look in an unflinching way at our past. And when we see a wrong, we've got to be prepared to recognise it, name it, and act to redress it. This surely is something that all governments can learn from. It's something I hope that this government will take note of and act upon. The women caught up in this scandal have been trying for too long to achieve justice. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government has an opportunity to act."
Madam Deputy Speaker, today is the first anniversary of my maiden speech, and this is my 100th contribution to this place. Giving a voice to the voiceless is a central cause that I and my colleagues on these benches seek to deliver. Speaking this debate today is most apt in pursuing my purpose in Parliament. I thank my honourable friends from Wirral South and Liverpool West Derby for their touching contributions and for securing this very important debate. As a member of the Backbench Business Committee, I was delighted to support the allocations debate in committee. I'd also like to share directly a story by a woman from my home city of Leeds, as the member for Liverpool West Derby did. Helen Jeffreys was 17 when she gave birth to a baby son, with no support available, no access to advice, and certainly no access to any housing or social benefits. Her son was forcibly taken from Helen and placed for adoption. She said, and she told us, "We weren't given a choice, no offer of support at all. I held out until the last possible moment, and it was obvious to everyone that I wanted to keep him, but he was quite literally dragged out of my arms." Her son was born in Leeds, but placed by the Church of England Adoption Society in York. He was allowed no contact with his birth mother or father. In a world without fertility treatment, there were many would-be parents desperate to adopt children. The culture was, as Helen puts it, to get the mothers out of the way as quickly as possible. Her son was given no information about his birth mother and father. When Helen requested his adoption file years later, she found a one-page document with many factual inaccuracies. The paper, for example, noted the birth mother and father's occupation as art students. They weren't art students. Since then, Helen has been reunited with the son she lost so many years ago. But we must remember that this is not the end of the story. Television programmes can lead us to believe that reunion is equivalent to the happy endings that exist in fairy tales. It is, of course, nothing of the sort, and can bring all sorts of new issues and challenges that must be dealt with for those families, both adopted and biological. What happened to Helen and many, many other mothers like her is a national disgrace. It is not history. This is real-life pain, grief and suffering that lives on today in the lives of those who have to carry on those memories and those histories. I personally want to thank Helen for sharing a story with us, but it is now time that we gave something back to her and to all the other mothers in that situation. We must learn the lessons and understand properly the pain that still exists today. I'm sure this House would agree. Helen, at the very least, deserves an apology. Now is surely the time for the Prime Minister to step up to the plate and give Helen and all the other mothers the apology that they deserve.
Yeah.
Boss Charalambos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. One can only imagine the stress and heartache that many women face when giving up a child for adoption. For virtually all women, there is an everlasting sense of loss that remains with them throughout their lives, and guilt about giving up their child to an unknown future because they're unable to look after their baby. Thankfully, there are support agencies and charities that people can turn to for advice about parenting and adoption. And we're also fortunate enough to live in a country where raising a child as a single parent is not taboo and is generally accepted by society. But unfortunately, this wasn't always the case. And in post-World War II society, there was a moral backlash against women who were pregnant, with some women being thrown out of their parents' home for bringing so-called shame and disgrace on them. Social workers and others in authority were not necessarily helpful in counteracting those attitudes, and adoption was pushed on young pregnant women as the only sensible option for them. Pregnant women were then sent to mother and baby homes, which were run by religious or state organisations, which made the pain and suffering worse. And as so eloquently described by my honourable friend, the member for Wirral South, this is where the suffering took place and where the forced adoption was happening. They're also not advised about things like the National Assistance Act, which was introduced by the government to help those who were destitute and thus could have helped them, nor were they advised of any other benefits they could have sought to help them find a way through the difficult situation they were in. One such woman was my constituent, Jean Robertson-Malloy, who is present here today and was referred to by my own friend, the member for Liverpool West Derby. Jean reluctantly had been pressurised to give up her baby in the 1950s, and her daughter was sent to be adopted in New Zealand. Jean spent years of anguish and guilt, wondering what had happened to her daughter and what sort of person she was developing into. It's hard to know if this is what inspired Jean to become a social worker, but she dedicated her life to helping others. She was eventually reunited with her daughter, and so that story had a happy ending, but the adoption seriously affected her life and that of her daughter, who, as many children who have been adopted, wonder why they were given up for adoption and why they were rejected. Jean, realising that her experience was not unique, decided to help found a group called the Movement for Adoption Apology. This movement has actively been campaigning over the years and is seeking an acknowledgement and apology from the government in recognition of the fact that the state turned a blind eye to the forced adoption scandal, causing a great deal of distress and mental anguish to those affected. On the 21st of March 2013, Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard gave a full apology on behalf of the Australian government for forced adoption, and Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach of Ireland, has also given such apology recently. The Movement for an Adoption Apology are asking the government to do the same. The harm done over the years by forced adoption cannot be undone by an apology, but an apology would go a long way to comforting those affected. And so I ask the Minister if you will ask the Prime Minister to please make such an apology to the mothers and children affected by the forced adoption, and to tell the full story of the forced adoption practice that happened all those decades ago, but is still very much an issue with those affected, and to provide the support that's so desperately needed still to this day by everyone who's been affected by the scandal.
Yes.
John McNally.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The narratives we have heard today, particularly from the member for Wirral South, have expressed all our concerns and the high emotions involved in this awful practice, this awful unjust practice. We have enormous sympathy for mothers who went through this, and it is right our social attitudes have moved on, and we now have hopefully robust safeguards in place when it comes to adoption, and I thank the member from Wirral South for securing this debate today. Madam Deputy Speaker, these mothers were forced, as we have heard, to make extremely upsetting choices simply because of the prevailing moral standard of the time. Madam Deputy Speaker, I do know that the Scottish ministers have a great deal of sympathy for those women whose accumulated experiences clearly show them to be the victims of a prevailing moral and social behaviour of the time. Nowadays, I think it is only right and just that we have more robust safeguards in place when mothers or people consider adoption. It is widely accepted that in the years after World War II until the 1970s, Many single mothers were reluctant to part with their babies, but in reality they were faced with little choice. Public opinion and private moral standards at the time placed enormous pressure on single mothers, making it impossible for many to retain care of their babies. Since the 1970s, there have been major shifts in the way we see the family, single mothers and the rearing of children. Our society has hopefully rightly moved on, and we know that there is nothing wrong with single or unmarried women bringing up children. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Scottish Government provides funding to Birthlink, who in turn provide services to individuals and families separated by adoption, which includes maintaining the adoption contract register for Scotland, where they help children, parents and relatives who have been affected by adoption, either by looking for somebody, getting information or just having someone to talk to. Madam Deputy Speaker, the notable Scottish author Irvine Welsh is the patron of Birthlink, and he sums up their great work when he said, "Birthlink is an organisation that brings people together when often cruel circumstances have parted them. Ultimately, all we have in life is in each other." So I'm proud and I'm honoured to be a patron of this wonderful charity, and I absolutely echo his sentiments. The Scottish Government provide and maintain the adoption contract register for Scotland, as well as services to individual families, as I have said, separated by adoption. They develop partnerships with local authorities and voluntary adoption agencies to share expertise and highlight the importance of post-adoption services, with a view to explore additional sources of income and, importantly, raise public profile of the adoption contract register for Scotland, to increase the number of service users, including improvements to their own current website. Nowadays, it is right that we have these robust safeguards in place when people consider adoption in Scotland. For example, should a birth mother want to place her child for adoption, the following will happen. Before the birth mother and any relative whom the mother has chosen to involve will be offered advice and information about adoption by social work services, which will include whether there are any members of the child's biological family who might be willing to adopt the child. And if this is something the parents might wish to consider, information and details of the legal process, as well as the type of families who are available to them. What issues can arise for adopted people and birth parents across the lifespan? What opportunities birth relatives have to meet prospective adopters? Madam Deputy Speaker, every effort is made to establish if the decision is being made freely by the mother and that she is not pressurised by anyone. And if wanted, there could be an offer of a referral to counselling services with ongoing support from social workers. Once the child is born, arrangements will usually have been made for the child to be placed with foster carers and prospective adopters, but the mother is encouraged to see and hold the child, meet with the foster carers, prospective adopters before the child is moved from the hospital. Legally, a mother's consent is ineffective if it is given less than 6 weeks after the child is born. This is simply to give the mother a chance to perhaps bond with the child and the opportunity to change her mind regardless of any previous discussions. It is not unknown for birth mothers to change their mind following the birth of the child. Should this happen, every encouragement and support is given unless there are serious child protection concerns for her to assume care for her child. Once the child is placed with adopters, plans are usually drawn up about what information will be shared between adopters and the birth mother. The mother will be offered a number of follow-up sessions with a social worker, but many choose to get on with their lives at this point. This is a great progression. However, facilitating information exchange creates opportunities for the birth mother to link up with the adoption agency and seek additional support if she requires. The birth parents are eligible for adoption support services. Some agencies offer support groups. Others might refer the mother to mental health services, as has been said before, and birth mothers might contact informal groups via the internet. In the case of contested adoptions, while social work services within local authorities and other adoption service agencies may recommend that a child be placed for adoption, it is ultimately the decision for a court to grant an adoption order or not. If one or both of the child's parents oppose the granting of an adoption, the relevant court must decide whether the parents are unable satisfactorily to discharge their parental responsibilities and exercise their parental rights, and are likely to continue to be unable to do so. Madam Deputy Speaker, the welfare of the child is of the paramount consideration in the granting of an adoption order. Contested adoptions do not affect discussions about possible information exchange and the support offered to the birth parents. However, as birth parents are likely to reject discussions about potential adopters, meeting them and be resistant to adoption plans, they will be unlikely to accept any offers of support available. Madam Deputy Speaker, to conclude, it is so important to provide lots of TLC and understanding to mothers at this extremely difficult time. And we all appreciate that the work that Birthlink and other organisations provide to mothers and families at this most sensitive time. And we do also agree that the Government should indeed issue an apology to women and children affected by this practice, and we support the motion for an adoption apology.
Emmanuel Buck.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable friends from Wirral South and Liverpool West Derby for securing today's debate and the Backbench Business Committee for granting it, and also thank the Movement for Adoption Apology for their tireless campaigning work. The pain and the suffering that the practice of historical forced adoption caused is a pain that has been largely expunged from the history books and has received limited attention. Yet the physical and emotional scars left behind are very real, very current, and have an enduring daily impact on those women, children and families involved. Their suffering is made more painful by the fact that as each day passes and no formal inquiries of any shape take place, the full truth may never be known. They may never be able to reunite with their children or share with them their story. Worse still, many adopted adults don't seek out their birth parents, as they and their adopters are under the false impression that they were freely, not forcibly, adopted. At the heart of today's debate are the harrowing human stories, such as those we've heard from my honourable friends from Leeds North West and Enfield Southgate, of the thousands of women and their babies that were taken from them after intensive coercion, at times force, and deceit carried out by the very institutions of the state that were supposed to be there to help and support them. There were no choices here. Anne Keane, our friend and former colleague, whose story has been told so characteristically, eloquently and passionately by my honourable friend from Wirral, very clearly showed that this was not about choices. This was a cultural attitude that was fostered by institutions and parts of the state who, instead of acting in the best interests of women and their babies, did the exact opposite. Culturally, the 50s, 60s and early 70s, where the majority of these forced adoptions took place, was a very different time, a point touched upon by my honourable friend from Liverpool West Derby. Today, adoption orders are largely made as a last resort to keep children safe from harm. But in these post-war years, many women who were pregnant out of wedlock were chastised and deemed unfit for motherhood. Birth control was less reliable, contraceptive pill was only available to women from 1967, and even then it was only those who were married. Welfare benefits were not as easily accessible, and sex education was non-existent. It was also a time when people held institutions of the state, teachers, welfare and social workers, benefits advisors, NHS staff, the church and GPs in a much higher regard than they do now, and in particular in working class communities. Anyone who held such a role were respected and were listened to by the community, and their advice was acted on, even when their advice was wrong. This debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, has only been made possible by the women coming forward and sharing their painful stories. It is my honour, although one with a heavy heart, to just share a few of them here today. Diana Defries, initially out of abject fear, concealed her pregnancy. When she eventually saw her GP, she was shipped off miles away from her home in London to a strict mother and baby home in Southampton. She was made to undertake physical work until she was admitted to hospital to give birth. In the hospital, she was treated like she didn't matter, separated from her baby, given Valium daily, which she refused to take, and injected with a drug that's not recommended now to stop her from lactating. After 15 days with her baby, she was taken on a train to Waterloo Station. When she arrived, she was taken to the Crusade of Rescue Officers in Ladbroke Grove, and her baby was forcibly taken from her. Madam Deputy Speaker, Diana was 16 years old when she gave birth to her daughter Stephanie. She had not long turned 17 when Stephanie was taken from her in the October of 1974. She received no postnatal care, was lied to by social services, told she had no other options and that adoption was the best option. She was told she was too young to receive any help, and a week later sent back to school and sworn to secrecy. She's not had any more children, but is thankfully reunited with her daughter. But in her own words, she says they have had to navigate a lot of challenges and rightly states that any apology should be for the both of them. Attachment is a two-way process. Children separated from their birth mothers to varying degrees will feel a sense of trauma and loss no matter how young they are or how long they have spent in their mum's care. Veronica Smith in 1964 was 24 years old and sent to a private maternity hospital, isolated from everyone she knew at a time when she needed them more than ever. She was with her baby for 1 week until an advert was placed in a local paper. Her baby was fostered, then adopted by strangers. Madam Deputy Speaker, Veronica's story, like so many others we've heard today, is a story of powerlessness, of things being done to them, not with them, on the false assertion that they and their babies would be better off and that if they really loved them, then they wouldn't resist adoption. Another woman told me she was raped behind a local pub by her then boyfriend's brother. Her baby was placed into foster care and adopted at 4 months old. She described to me her treatment by officials as being characterised by submission and deep shame. The only shame here should be firmly on the shoulders of those who harmed her and the state institutions that failed her and her baby. Others have told me of being abused when they were sent away, being ostracised, subject to degrading and vicious verbal abuse from professionals. There is a common thread in all of these stories. It is one of lies, control, coercion, force, abuse and cruelty that has led to a lifetime of mental health difficulties, physical harm and emotional distress. Not knowing where your child is, not knowing if they know you were forced into giving them up or not, is a pain so deep and so pervasive. What we are asking for here today is a very simple, straightforward act on the government's part. An apology to the women, children and families for the enduring pain and undue suffering. It would, in Diana's words, allow us to show the lifelong impact of unexpressed grief for unacknowledged loss. In his response, I would like the Minister to explain briefly his government's grounds for rejecting a public inquiry and whether or not he's considering explaining any other ways of shedding light on these travesties, such as conducting an initial scoping exercise within his department, appointing a small team to even review the issues raised here today, or, as my honourable friend from Wirral South has said, set up some support groups and make documents available. The Minister does have options available, so I would say very politely to him, he should do so. We are now living, Madam Deputy Speaker, in different times, and the likelihood of what happened to Anne, Diana, Veronica and thousands more women happening now is diminished, but their pain is a pain that endures every single moment of every day. The very least they deserve is an apology, and I sincerely hope the Minister will confirm there's going to be one.
Minister Nadeem Zahawi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to begin by commending the honourable members for Wirral South and Liverpool West Derby on securing this very important debate. No one, I think, can fail to be moved by the plight of the young mothers and their children whose lives have been blighted by the unacceptable practices of the past. It is only right that this House acknowledges this unnecessary pain and suffering. Many of my colleagues have spoken movingly about their constituents, the member for Leeds North West, about Helen Enfield Southgate, about Jean Robertson Malloy, who happens to be the stepmom of the member for Liverpool Derby, West Derby, and of course our former colleague Anne Keane, who I know that the member for Wirral South spoke so emotionally about and so movingly about, and of course Helen Jeffreys as well. The member for Falkirk outlined the excellent work that Birthlink do in this area as well. I would like to, Madam Deputy Speaker, add my voice and to express my deepest sympathy to all those affected. These women were let down, in many cases by their families who would not support them, but also by professionals and organisations in the sector who allowed society's moral attitudes at the time towards unmarried mothers to influence their practice. They were put under enormous pressure, we heard so eloquently by other members, bring to life those tragic stories. And they were often faced with a stark choice, Madam Deputy Speaker, of either returning home without their babies or fending for themselves. The devastating consequences of these mothers and their sons and daughters are clear to see. Mothers talk of their feelings of loss, guilt, and shame, their unbearable grief for a lost relationship and not knowing if their child was still alive. We also know that many adopted children have suffered too, with overwhelming feelings of rejection, struggling with their identity and difficulties in bonding and forming attachments. The Honourable Member for Wirral South spoke movingly about the experiences of her constituent Sarah and Sarah's mother and the impact it has had on their lives. It is truly shocking to hear how single mothers were treated at that time in our country. Adoptions during this period were generally handled through agencies run by the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church and the Salvation Army. They have quite rightly apologised for their involvement in past poor practice. It is important for us to recognise and to accept, and we accept, that the legislation at that time was not robust enough to prevent it. I deeply, deeply regret this was the case. Successive governments have taken action to strengthen legislative framework since then, so it cannot happen again. The Honourable Member for Wirral South rightly says it is important to understand what happened in the past and who was responsible. These issues were closely looked at by the Houghton Committee in 1972 and covered the key issues of who arranged adoptions and the problems this brought, evidence about mothers not able to give proper consent to relinquish their babies, and the lack of access to birth records to allow tracing later in life. It also covered the issue raised by the Honourable Member about the role of the NHS and private nursing homes, and reported that the British Medical Association had called for changes to be made to how adoptions were made. I think it is unlikely that further research will bring new information. Evidence provided from birth parents suggests that record keeping during that time was poor, absent, and often inaccurate. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me move on to why lessons have been learnt from the past. We are confident that what happened to these mothers, I will give it.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister. He's making a really worthwhile speech. He just mentioned a report of a committee, I think, of this House. Would he be so good as to make sure that the reports and the details of that committee are made available in some public way? He might ask the library to do it, because I think it's very important to point to that work that has already been done. It sounds like it was done a long time ago, so I think that's something that we would want to discuss as we go forward.
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend for that point. I will certainly endeavour to do so. Let me move on to why lessons have been learnt, Madam Deputy Speaker, from the past. We are confident that what happened to these mothers and their children could not be repeated today. Society now takes a very different attitude to single mothers. The legislative framework has been transformed beyond recognition. Today, the key principle is that children are generally best looked after within their family, with their parents playing a full part in their lives. Single mothers are given the support they need so that, of course I will.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Just on a point of clarification, the report that he's referring to that's already been done by this House, that was in 1962.
I thank the honourable member. I did actually say that in referring to that report. It was the 1972 report. Today, Madam Deputy Speaker, the key principle is that children are generally best looked after within their family. And of course, single mothers are given the support they need so that they can remain as a family. This is as it should be in, I'm sure, all of our views. Children are only removed permanently without the consent of the parent by a court. It has to be satisfied that the child is suffering significant harm or is likely to suffer significant harm if they remain with their birth family. Courts must consider all the evidence put before them, including evidence from the parents themselves, who will have legal representation. Adoption agencies and fostering services are now inspected by Ofsted, whose role is to ensure that practice is in line with the legal framework. For the mothers who are at the heart of this debate, it is essential that they are able to trace their children and that their children are able to establish their parentage. The Honourable Member for Wirral South calls on the Government to work with organisations who support people who experience the consequences of historic forced adoption to create a small service that will help with tracing family and support. Those affected by past adoption practice can already access intermediary services to help them trace their birth children or birth parents and establish whether contact is possible. Intermediary services are provided by registered adoption agencies, including local authorities and voluntary adoption agencies and registered adoption support agencies. When an intermediary agency finds a person, contact can be arranged if both parties agree. Birth relatives and adopted adults can also add their details to the adoption contact register at the General Register Office to find a birth relative or an adopted person. There is support for birth parents and adult adoptees who have suffered with mental anguish and illness, in addition to the NHS mental health services available for those with conditions such as stress and depression. A number of voluntary adoption agencies and adoption support agencies also offer specialist birth family counselling, often under contract to local authorities, Madam Deputy Speaker. I should like to thank again the Honourable Member for Wirral South and the Honourable Member for Liverpool West Derby for today's debate. The Honourable Member, my shadow Minister opposite, asked very specifically about a public inquiry. None of us, I think, dispute that these women were victims of poor adoption practice all those years ago. But I believe that it is unlikely that a public inquiry would uncover new facts. We believe that the lessons of the time have been learned and have led to significant change to legislation and practice now. No child is removed from their birth family unless they have suffered significant harm or are at risk of such harm. And of course, parents have legal representatives. Of course I will.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. And he referred to a 1972 inquiry. Does he recognise that a lot of the mothers who've now spoken openly would not have spoken openly at that time, and I imagine therefore wouldn't have had an opportunity to have their voices heard in that inquiry? That is the case for some kind of process, be it a public inquiry or some other process leading to an apology now.
I do take that on board, and he raises an important point. I'm very happy that if one or both of them would like to meet with me and bring the mothers with them so that actually I can hear directly from them as well. I hope all those affected can take some comfort in the knowledge that what happened to them is so public and is on public record for all to see and understand. this House rightly acknowledges that this appalling historic practice has left a legacy of hurt and pain. I hope where possible, many a mother and a child can be reunited and be given the comfort of building a family relationship. I thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Govern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's really been my pleasure and honour to lead on this debate today. I want to thank my friend, the Shadow Minister, who I felt gave an excellent speech, and also the Minister who has listened carefully, I think, in this debate. I would just make a couple of very brief remarks on what the Minister just said. I felt his offer to meet us was very, very welcome and will be taken up. And then we might just talk in some detail privately about the reasons why local authority services might not always be able to meet the need that there certainly is. And a little more, Madam Deputy Speaker, about why it is crucial that the government does consider a public apology delivered by the Prime Minister. But I will look forward to speaking directly with the Minister on that point, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the members for Liverpool West Derby, Leeds North West and Enfield Southgate. They all participated in a very eloquent way. But most of all, I thank the women who are the reason we're here today. I'm glad that we have opened the door to this story. Those stories are now on record. They've been through an awful lot, Madam Deputy Speaker, just to get to this House today. And I hope that the House's affirmation of the motion today leads to a broader acknowledgement of our history, past practices, and why those practices were so very wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is, as on the order paper. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. What an excellent debate. We now come to the debate on lessons from the collapse of Carillion. And I call Rachel Reeves to move the...
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the House has considered lessons from the collapse of Carillion. I am grateful to the Backbench Business Committee for scheduling this debate today, and it is a timely one. This Sunday will be the 6-month anniversary since Carillion entered liquidation. When it collapsed, Carillion employed 42,000 people, more than 19,000 of them working here in the UK. It held liabilities of £7 billion, including owing £2 billion to 30,000 suppliers and subcontractors, and it held just £29 million in cash to meet those liabilities.